Orlando. Orlando. I love you, Orlando. SeaWorld and Disney and Pod Golfing. To be free, don't worry about me. And just like the movies, we play out our last scene.
Hello and welcome to another interview edition of the History on Film podcast. My name is Ross Lennon and I'm joined today with Dr. David Morton, and we are talking about his brand new book, Motion Picture Paradise, A History of Florida's Film and Television Industry. Dr. Morton, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Ross. I'm really excited to be here and even more excited that the book is finally out.
I'm very excited. This is our first UCF faculty member joining us today, so Knight's excellence continues onward. This book begins literally with the invention of film and continues into the present day. And there are just so many interesting stories and unique characters woven throughout. This was not only a fascinating work of history, this was a really fun read.
Thank you.
So you start your book with this idea that I was not familiar with, and that was that Jacksonville, Florida could have been the Hollywood that we know today. Other historians have said that. You challenged that idea. Let's start by saying, how is Jacksonville almost Hollywood?
Yeah, so I think it's important just to point out that in the early 1900s, we had a number of different film communities that were popping up. In 1908, the Edison Manufacturing Company sent Nickelodeon Studios down to Jacksonville. They had a very productive winter season between December of 1908 to March of 1909. They made about 40 movies. And this is where everybody goes like, whoa. And then you have to like point out the fact that these are 4 or 5 minute, 6 minute long reels. But the Nickelodeon Studios was just the first bulwark of a bigger invasion of, again, these so-called movie people to North Florida throughout much of the late 1900s and early 1910s. I think it's important to point out that the first movies being made in what eventually would become Hollywood. At that time, Hollywood's still an Orange Grove town in Southern California, is that we had, like, I think, one movie made in 1908, another movie D.W. Griffith made called In Old California in 1910. And really, throughout much of the 1910s, North Florida, at least in terms of number of film output, outproduced Southern California at least 3-1. So, I mean, there is definitely some credence that North Florida was a very actively sought after film center. I think it's also important to point out that it was not the only film center, that we have studios in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Louisiana, Texas. The American motion picture industry of the late 1900s and early 1910s was a constellated set of communities that were not necessarily with one major center of gravity, maybe notwithstanding Fort Lee, New Jersey, and the greater New York area. But that said, I think that's been like one of the big enduring myths in Florida film history, has been that had things just gone very slightly differently, we would have replicated what became the Hollywood studio system and what emerged through the studio system in Southern California in North Florida instead.
And I think one thing to point out that maybe people might not be familiar with is that sunshine was the big draw. And that's literally because films had to be shot outside or with as much natural light as possible. And so it was a technological restriction that there was less sunlight during less time, less hours of the day up north in New York. And so that's why they were seeking Texas, Florida, California. You know, it was just as much the scenery as much as the access to sunlight.
And I would also add then to landscape and the opportunity to film outdoors, where by that point, like, we're starting to break from a much more stodgy version of filmmaking, where we're mostly seeing throughout much of 1900 and in the late 1890s, basically film replicating the theater. You have the camera fixed in one location, actors will move in and out of frame, and you're basically replicating theatrical productions and theatrical stylings, and that's about it. By the time we get to the late 1900s and early 1910s, we're seeing filmmakers get a little bit more adventurous in where they're placing the camera. I mean, we have other examples like Edwin Porter's The Life of the American Firefighter and The Great Train Robbery that uses some type of location and outdoor sequences, but it is really those kind of landscape opportunities. And you're right, the weather is a major factor. In fact, Jacksonville advertised to movie producers over 272 days of sunlight, which sounds like a little bit of a lie, especially considering, how long the summer has felt for all of us out here. But yeah, that's definitely a reason why southern climates were being sought out throughout much of that period was that you had greater opportunities for outdoor filming, for landscape filming, and just this opportunity to have access to sunlight for the cameras
Yeah, no mention was, however, of the humidity. I didn't see
at
I didn't
all.
see that included in any of the advertising that you referenced in the book.
No, a lot of complaints afterward, but
Mhm.
not the advertising.
And so, with that in mind, why wasn't it as close as other historians thought that Jacksonville was not Hollywood?
Well, I think a lot of it is just local pride. And the first major account that tried to promote this idea of an almost Hollywood goes back to the 1950s with a writer for the Florida Times Union who interviewed several of the silent film stars who were still alive to talk about their experiences. And he more or less concluded that, hey, we were the almost Hollywood. And, it's a easy story then to replicate. Other historians then, see this initial tagline in a newspaper from the 1950s, and they take the idea and run with it. The problem too is that I think some of these local histories then also just stay in their locality. So they're thinking just within the context of what's happening in Florida or maybe the wider Sunbelt South, but they're not asking questions about what is happening in the American motion picture industry at large. Basically, what we saw unfold is that in the 1900s, we have these diverging flanks of approaches to filmmaking. So you have the Edison Manufacturing Company and the Motion Picture Patent Company, which ends up becoming the trust that Thomas Edison very infamously puts together in 1908, the same year that the first filmmakers are actively beginning to come to North Florida. And the Motion Picture Trust has, I think, very rightfully, especially with our antitrust kind of leanings, yeah, as historians, been villainized very heavily for their inability to compromise with dissenting studios, with their monopoly tactics, and also a lot of liberties being taken on creative freedoms. That said, though, we have a whole other flank that also emerges with the so-called independent filmmakers, which is ironic because these filmmakers were really producers like Carl Laemmle, Adolf Zukor, Marcus Lowe, all end up creating the foundations for the multimedia conglomerates that we still see to this very day. So they end up moving to Southern California, as legend has it, to get away from Thomas Edison and to have some degree of self-autonomy, while Jacksonville in North Florida really does remain very firmly in the orbit of New York. And I think that's another thing that's like very important to point out is that the studios that did come to North Florida, they may have had film sets and they may have had production centers, but they did not have film processing labs. They did not have all the other materials that the independent filmmakers who took a 3 to 4 day train ride across the country would then need to remain self-sufficient. In fact, even early Jacksonville advertising campaigns to bring producers in would argue that, hey, or would just say basically, come on down, we're just a 27-hour ride from Broadway. So again, a film crew would come down, they would shoot for a season, maybe anywhere between 10 to a dozen films, and then they would go right back up to Broadway and either do a theatrical run or find a whole nother location to go shoot at. So I think that's like one aspect of it is that the film industry looked very different during this time period. It also was very different, at least the industry that was emerging out of New Jersey and New York in the 1900s and 1910s.
And we really, in Florida, see this sort of on again, off again relationship between the Florida state government and the film industry, where one administration wants to bring the film industry in and another one wants to push it out. Seems like that had a major where the governor is constantly changing, but the film industry has a longer memory.
Absolutely. And I mean, one thing to point out too is that you can't separate the prohibition movement from also anti-vice crusaders and their efforts to regulate the movies. The film industry is one of the few industries in the United States that ended up having its own self-regulatory body. Later, we see this very famously with the Hays Code. And Will Hayes, the whole reason for the code was to keep the government out and allow the studio system to self-regulate. And that's like where we see other censorship czars like Joseph Breen coming in with the don'ts and be carefuls and all these different, very carefully regulated approaches to what can and cannot be shown on screen. So there was an ongoing dialogue within the industry between Catholic clergymen, Jewish rabbis, Protestant reformers, and motion picture producers because of this fear of being boycotted. Even going back to the winter of 1908, when Clem came down to North Florida, the mayor of New York had issued a citywide Nickelodeon ban on Christmas Eve of 1908 and had threatened to effectively shut down movie production studios across the entire city. William Fox, again, the founder of what became 20th Century Fox, launched a lawsuit against the mayor of New York, George McClellan Jr., was also the son of the Union Army general, who had risen to power on this anti-vice type of movement. So I think it's important because we're looking at the prohibition movement beginning to gain traction, and the same desire for Sunday blue laws to prevent, say, alcohol from being bought and sold on Sundays were also being applied toward whether or not people could go to the movies or what kind of movies they could see. It's a bit of a long digression, but to go to the main point of what's happening in Florida is that, well, first of all, Florida ends up imposing prohibition about 3 to 4 years before the rest of the country. Florida, as we already know, has been relatively conservative leaning throughout much of its more recent history. And in the early 20th century, it definitely was leaning toward that. In 1916, we had a one-eyed Baptist preacher originally from Alabama, by the name of Sidney Katz. He was nicknamed the Cracker Messiah, and he led this incredibly subversive political campaign to become governor, where all the other gubernatorial candidates would do whistle stop tours on the different train lines from Henry Flagler and Henry Plant. Katz got in the car allegedly with a revolver and a Bible, and he would give these like stump speech sermons to get people in fishing villages and in I guess if you will, cow towns that have not even seen a legislator, let alone a governor candidate. And he wins on the Prohibition Party platform. So again, prohibitionism being also against alcohol was also very strongly against the movies. So that was one part of the turn. In Jacksonville itself, though, it was a pretty lively and raucous place in the 1910s. The mayor of Jacksonville, who was actually mayor at the time of the Great Fire in 1901, became mayor again in 1915. His name was John Edward Theodore Bowden, but he liked to go by the initials Just Easy Times Boys. And he ran on a pro-prostitution platform, or at least to decriminalize prostitution in Jacksonville in 1915. He wanted to bring gaming into the city. So he was definitely the embodiment of the vice that anti-vice crusaders like Sidney Katz and other leaders in the Florida government were not necessarily in favor of. So that was some of the underlying political tensions that were happening in Florida at that time as well.
So throughout the book, the focus of the entertainment industry begins in Jacksonville, and then it spreads to Tampa, Miami, and then later on it moves into Orlando. These places are all very different, but they have some similarities as well. How were they similar and how were they different? And Miami, in the 1910s and 20s is very different than the Miami that we'll talk about later in the 1980s.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, what I would say here too is that filmmakers are all over the state throughout this entire time, where Jacksonville is certainly the center of gravity for where many industry people were coming into the state. But they're not just staying in Jacksonville. St. Augustine was a very frequent stopover for silent filmmakers. I'll make a plug for Thomas Graham's Silent Films in St. Augustine, a really wonderful book that goes into just how incredibly nuanced filmmaking styles were, and the use of landscape and environment in St. Augustine. But you had companies like the Tampa Films Incorporated in the 1910s. Harry Kelly helped to produce the first versions of the Tarzan the Ape Man stories long before Johnny Weissmuller came along. And then you had an editor for the Miami Herald named E.G. Sewell and Glenn Curtis, the aviation pioneer, who was a real estate investor as well, team up to create Miami Studios in Miami at a time when it was still a fishing village for really the most part. What's interesting there too is that Miami in the 1910s is in a situation, at least in terms of its population and degree of development, as what we're seeing in Southern California. The bad luck is that, of course, in 1926 and 1928, two of the worst hurricanes in recorded history end up hitting South Florida, and they end up destroying some of those studio facilities. We could have seen a very interesting, another what if kind of outcome had those hurricanes not struck and had more studios been able to proliferate in Miami at a time when the city was still emerging. D.W. Griffith, who again helped to put Hollywood on the map, ends up going to Fort Lauderdale in the 1920s, and he ends up shooting three films consecutively in the early 1920s. The productions of those do not go very well. During one production, his lead actress ends up falling from a coconut tree, and she ends up severely injuring her intestines and actually died several weeks after the production came to an end. On another shoot, Griffith and his longtime collaborator and cinematographer, G.W. Bitzer, end up scouting out islands near Bimini, and they get shipwrecked. And it takes 3 days for the U.S. Coast Guard to recover them from, the shipwreck. So there are also a lot of logistical challenges. Another problem was that when Griffith shot in South Florida, going back to where I talked about sunlight, the sunlight was too strong. And in fact, it overexposed some of the sequences that were being shot to such a degree that some of the footage was absolutely unusable. So there's like a lot of different challenges, both environmental, political, and logistical at this time. Again, going back to what you said, it's important to think of Florida as a frontier state in the 1910s and 1920s. It's still very much on the periphery of the rest of the country.
And you also mentioned the technical craft. I think it was Griffith who complained that the staff that he was trying to hire down there didn't necessarily have the same experience as people that he could hire in California.
Yeah, so that wasn't Griffith, but that was another big director named Rex Ingram, who he also directed Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the movie that introduced flamenco to American culture and also introduced Rudolph Valentino and turned him into the Latin lover of the 1920s. Ingram was using South Florida as a space to shoot several South Seas romances, and he was very frustrated with the degree of inexperience that the production teams that he came across had.
What about Tampa?
Yeah, so Tampa had a very interesting on and off relationship with the motion picture industry. Again, as long as like we can trace it, we can go from the 1910s to The Punisher, like in 2004, with like Thomas Jane and John
Mhm.
Travolta. But in the 1910s, as Jacksonville is beginning to solidify itself as a film center, D.B. McKay was the mayor of Tampa, and he was very interested in getting a slice of it as well. And he worked very closely with several different real estate developers to create these different film cities Most infamously, we have a film city called Sun City, which becomes part and parcel of some of the bigger problems that happened with the Florida land boom, where the city ends up naming all its streets after major movie stars. So you have Pickford Way, Chaplin Avenue, so on and so forth. And the part of the promotion was to basically bring the stars to just outside of Tampa and create what is already being built in Universal City or in Burbank or in Southern California, right outside of Tampa. Most of these don't really come to fruition. In Newport Richey, we have at least like one exception where an actor named Thomas Megan, who was known as the Tom Cruise of the silent era, ended up actually buying a home in Newport Richey. And he ended up buying a theater as well. He recruited a couple other directors and filmmakers to come very briefly to the area. But for the most part, a lot of these speculations left a lot of money on the table, very little actually being built, and then a lot of bad blood, both from the community and the industry at large. By the 1930s, the governor of Florida, Doyle Carlton, again, we sort of keep seeing these shifts in Florida politics, became a very avowed movie booster after he saw how a production of a movie called Hell Harbor by Henry King spent over $1 million in the Tampa Bay area, right in the middle of the Great Depression. And he ends up commissioning a friend of his, a real estate developer by the name of Trenton Collins, to create a committee for the development of the motion picture. And this was a very interesting turning point in the film industry at large, once again we're going to this transition from silent film to sound film. And ironically, with the transition from silent to sound, film got a lot more constricted once again. A lot of these films now were no longer able to be shot outdoors or on location. They had to be hermetically sealed in sound stages. So now, knowing what we do about the Florida weather, or what the industry knows about the Florida weather, a self-contained soundstage is not an issue, right? And if you can get land at bottom dollar prices, especially after the collapse of housing prices following the land boom, this could be a real opportunity to bring the studios in. It's also important to point out that a very famous writer and socialist politician named Upton Sinclair had run for governor of California
Hmm.
in 1934. If you've seen the movie Mank,
Hmm.
they make that big
Yes.
plot point is like what would happen if Sinclair had won as governor of California. And one of his first campaign promises was to put movie moguls in jail for tax evasion and for not paying in their share to the statewide infrastructure. So movie moguls were, at least at the time as a bluff, looking for the exit. And this is where a really fascinating set of letters between Trenton Collins, the governor of Florida, and these different movie moguls start happening, where they start laying out their exit plan for if Sinclair were to be elected as governor of California. Now, Sinclair loses, again, because of electioneering influence and a lot of bought off votes by the movie moguls, but it leaves us with that big what if. Had that money have come in, had there been a disruption in the studio industry, we could have also seen Tampa Bay develop into a major film center.
So the Black community in Florida in the 1910s and 1920s saw filmmaking as an opportunity to advance the conversation on civil rights, despite facing several barriers to making their projects. What was Birth of a Race, and why does its troubled production history tell us about filmmaking at the time? And so, just to set up the audience, when we look at the history of a film, we don't just look at its critical reception or its popular reception. An important thing to do is to look at the production of the film, sort of what went into it. That can really tell us a lot about both the environment and the society that made it.
Yeah, so the story of the making of Birth of a Race is honestly, again, like a great example of the challenges that come with collaboration in filmmaking. Also, the perils of what we call development hell. and how sometimes the initial idea does not end up translating onto the final film print either. So, just a little bit of context. D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation is the film, to at least some degree, has been credited as the film that had started the modern American motion picture industry. It is certainly not the first feature-length film made either in the United States or worldwide, although Griffith, being a great self-promoter, would give himself a lot of credit for starting the feature film industry. Of course, is a very troubling film, especially within our modern lens. The first half of the film is a conventional Civil War drama made at a time when the Civil War was as far away from filmmakers and audiences' memory as we are from the Vietnam War today. So you have plenty of Confederate and Union Army veterans still around to comment on what they've seen. So there's a lived history right with that. Griffith, he was born and raised in Kentucky. His father was a colonel in the Confederate Army, and he has a very strange ideology where he certainly subscribed to the lost cause narrative that looked at the plight of the Confederacy as a heroic cause, but he also was a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, one of the last films that Griffith ends up making is a biography of Abraham Lincoln. It's awful. I don't recommend it, but needless to say, this is like part of the challenge within the ideology being presented. Using a history of the American South written by Woodrow Wilson, who by this point is president of the United States, he also then elevates the Ku Klux Klan to the level of the heroic defenders of Christendom and white supremacist values, using white supremacy unironically as a positive term within the film. So, more or less, just to kind of sum up, it's a very racist film that uses the Ku Klux Klan as the heroes as opposed to the villains. The reason why I bring all this up is that the first films to introduce the Ku Klux Klan did not come with D.W. Griffith or his adaptation of Thomas Dixon's The Klansman. It actually came in Florida in the 1910s and actually the late 1900s. Nickelodeon Studios had perfected a genre of Civil War storytelling even before they had arrived in North Florida. And in fact, before we have the Western, we have the Southern as a film genre. Jean Gontier, who was a producer and often scenario writer for a number of these productions, became very interested in the story of a woman by the name of Belle Boyd, who would disguise herself as a Union Army soldier, infiltrate enemy lines, and then give reconnaissance to the Confederate Army. And one of the most popular series to come out of North Florida throughout that period were Gantier's The Girl Spies series. They also produced several variations of stories surrounding the Ku Klux Klan, where they are in the antagonist role. So I think that's also important to point out, where Griffith does a complete 180. The Nickelodeon Studios shows them, at the very least, as anti-heroes, and in many films as outright villains. So it's interesting just seeing how audiences are engaging with the representation of the Klan. Going back to the African American community, throughout this period, there's this effort by men like Oscar Micheaux and William Foster to create a industry that can show excellence in Black storytelling that can more or less serve as a counter to racist stereotypes and, again, very offensive representations like we see in movies like from D.W. Griffith. This is where we see the emergence of the idea for Birth of a Race. After Birth of a Nation comes out, two major things happen. One is that a Georgia lawyer named William Simmons was so inspired by the movie that he climbed to the top of Stone Mountain in Georgia, which would later become basically the Confederate Mount Rushmore. He burns a cross on top of Stone Mountain, just like he saw in the movie, something the historical Klan never did. And he swore a blood oath to resurrect the Ku Klux Klan from the dead. It was an organization that had been all but wiped out by the Department of Justice under Ulysses S. Grant during Reconstruction. And within just several short years, we have about 4 million active Klan members in the United States. The Klan marches on Washington with over 100,000 men in solidarity. D.W. Griffith, when he premiered The Birth of a Nation in the White House to Woodrow Wilson, was met with incredible applause. Wilson himself remarked that it was like he watched history written by lightning, and the terrible thing is it'd be all too true. So we're in a very dark period, culturally speaking, as a result of this film. It was a very dangerous film. And there was an effort almost immediately, both within the African American community, but also within activist communities at large, to offer a counter to this. And this is where Birth of a Race comes in. We have the Tuskegee Institute with Booker T. Washington, who wanted to do a adaptation of his own personal autobiography called Up From Slavery. And then you had W.E.B. Du Bois, who had an idea for a scenario that he had cultivated with the newly formed NAACP called Lincoln's Dream, both of which wanted to tell the story of race and Reconstruction from the Black perspective. Now, the politics of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are quite different. That's a whole nother conversation. We could probably do a whole episode on that right there. But basically, they're already at loggerheads. We have two very different scenarios that are being developed that are very different in perspective, but with the same objective. And that is to basically try to correct some of the unfair stereotypes that were put into D.W. Griffith's film. In fact, the Tuskegee Institute even reached out to Griffith as a possible director. And later, when the film completely ends up descending into development hell, because again, it's such a long, drawn out process here, they eventually turned to a man by the name of John W. Noble, who worked on Birth of a Nation, to become the director. Eventually, the NAACP swallows the production. W.E.B. Du Bois gets very upset with the scenario that was written. And two white women are commissioned by Universal Studios to redraft the entire production. So by the end, in 1918, when production of Birth of a Race does come out, basically we have a white scenario writer, a white director, and white producers who have completely lost touch with the initial vision. And the movie becomes this like very bizarre hodgepodge of different ideas. You have a biblical story, you have like the story of Moses mixed in with like a story of the transatlantic slave trade, and it's an incoherent mess. It was very upsetting because this could have been a wonderful opportunity to offer a very real counter to a very dangerous film. But because of all these different competing ideas and ideologies, it just descended into an incoherent mess.
So, what was Richard Norman Studios? And tell us a little bit about the museum now.
Yeah, so after the film industry left Jacksonville, and maybe we could revisit that too later in the talk. But in 1917, just to kind of sum up here, there was a mayor's election in which Just Easy Times Boys Bowden gets elected out of office. And the incumbent mayor, John W. Martin, was not a fan of the movies, not for the same ideological reasons that we see with, like, say, Sidney Katz and the Prohibitionists, but more because the movie people had boosted Bowden's campaign and they were like his opponent. So throughout 1917, 1819, Jacksonville has a string of bad luck. The Spanish influenza hits the city very hard. On top of that, then too, we see greater consolidation of the film studios in Southern California. And then finally, just like general mismanagement of the remaining production studios, combined with the collapse of the motion picture trust formed by Thomas Edison, all basically led to a drying up of the film industry in North Florida. So by 1922, many of these studios are gutted and they're available at bottom dollar prices. And this is where a itinerant filmmaker named Richard Norman comes into the story. Now, Norman was originally from Middleburg, Florida, so not too far from Jacksonville, but he had spent quite a bit of time in the Midwest, and he was more of like a traveling showman, where what he did was that he cut a feature-length film called The Green-Eyed Monster, and it ran about 60 minutes. But what he would then do is he would go to like a town in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin or Iowa, and then ask if the mayor would want him to shoot a movie there. And he very conveniently already had most of the movie already shot. So all he would have to then do is shoot a establishing scene of the main street, get the mayor's daughter to do a cameo in the movie, and maybe get a couple businesses showcased in the movie. And then he would recut those extra scenes into his movie, and then he would have a huge premiere in town. And he made a pretty good lifestyle out of that for several years. He also regularly visited Chicago, where African American film production companies like the Foster Photoplay Company and filmmakers like Oscar Micheaux were already active. So I'm certainly sure that he was aware of the vibrancy of the African American film market at this time, although he certainly had not made movies for African American audiences just yet. He returns to Florida and he ends up recutting The Green-Eyed Monster as a film called The Wrecker. Or actually, I think I might have had that flipped. He ends up recutting his film The Wrecker as The Green-Eyed Monster, and he ends up reshooting the entire film, this time with a all-black cast. And he ends up premiering it at several theaters, one owned by Frank Crowd on Jacksonville's Ashley Street, who later became a longtime collaborator of Richard Norman. And he not only sells out on the first night, like he would with his other home pride movies in the Midwest, but the audience has just kept on coming back. So he sets a real business opportunity. He ends up buying out the lot of the old Eagle Film Studio lot in Arlington, Jacksonville, and he commits himself to creating race films. And over the next 6 years, he ends up successfully making a number of increasingly talented and sophisticated films. In 1926, he creates his opus, The Flying Ace, which is still, I would argue, a really spectacular film. It holds up on its own merit. I teach African American film history here at UCF, and that's the first film I screen to my students to get started on the history of African American film. And you can imagine their apprehension of first seeing a silent film, then seeing a silent film with Black characters, especially in light of the legacy of movies like Birth of a Nation. Instead, I mean, by the end, we have such a great talk, both about the way in which the film approaches discussions on race, but also the way in which it showcases heroic Black characters. I mean, the title character is almost like a Sherlock Holmes character, where he is a fighter pilot from World War One, a detective, like an all-around just badass. Needless to say, Norman had a run of success with these different films. He also regularly visited African American communities in Oklahoma. So several of his movies were filmed on location in Oklahoma as well. So he kind of divided his time between these two areas. The reason why Norman Studios eventually failed had nothing to do with politics and had nothing to do necessarily with audiences losing interest in his stories, but it had everything to do with the transition to sound. And the tragedy was that Norman anticipated this transition at about the time that a good businessman would. The problem was that the standard sound equipment later became the Warner Vitaphone, while Norman, on the other hand, ended up investing in a device called the camera phone. And maybe about 10 projectors around the country ever adopted the camera phone as its technology. So he lost all his money after that and was not able to replicate that same degree of success. He still remained very close to the African American community, even after ending his career as a filmmaker. He would visit churches and high schools well until like the 1950s. I think in the 1960s, he ended up actually buying several movie theaters. And he, again, worked very closely with the community throughout much of that time, through the rest of his life.
So, the Florida real estate boom and the development of Florida's infrastructure are a constant theme throughout the first few decades of the film industry here. Perhaps the best example of this is Kennedy City Studios over near Tampa. What was the plan and what ended up actually happening there?
So Kennedy City on Wheaton's Island was, I think, a great example of the shortcomings and limitations of the proposals of these type of planned film cities, as well as the limitations that come within just the film industry in Florida during this time period. So Aubrey Kennedy was a former Paramount executive who was known to be the best in the business when sober. The problem was by the 1930s, he was not sober very often. And he was definitely a big grandstander, and he talked a very big game. I have plenty of his letters that I've gone through, and he's somebody who definitely talked up a lot of promises that did not necessarily fully deliver. That said, this is right in the middle of this collaboration between Governor Doyle Carlton and real estate developer Trenton Collins out of Tampa Bay. They're riding on the success of Hell Harbor, produced in Tampa, where the movie itself might not have been a very major financial success in terms of recouping its expenses for the production. But the amount of money that was spent by that production was so significant to the Tampa economy that it definitely perked up the ears of both local politicians and local land developers. So eventually, Kennedy manages to convince Collins and the government of St. Petersburg to build a film city on Wheaton Island. The land is bulldozed and sound stages are developed. So there are actual studio facilities that do get built, but these are mid-tier facilities where they're good for maybe producing a good, solid mid-budget production by today's standards. You could probably do a TV pilot on this type of studio ground, but you're not going to do a major big budget blockbuster. About the same time, Buster Keaton is coming down off of a disastrous contract he had had with MGM Studios. He had gotten into a contract with MGM just during that transition to sound, and MGM tried to put him in a comedy duo instead of allowing him to continue to make his own films where he was a star and director. So that loss of creative freedom frustrated Keaton to such a point that he ends up breaking with MGM and he's looking for something new. So he learns about Kennedy City. He arrives in St. Petersburg to a full-on gala welcome. The whole city comes out. The mayor of St. Petersburg gives him the key to the city, and he is very interested in using Kennedy City as a launching pad to film his comeback movies, the comeback movies that never actually end up coming. And he was also going to travel down to Cuba and shoot some of the sequences down there too. So long story short, what ends up happening is that Keaton comes and several other filmmakers like Marshall Nealon, who had previously worked with Paramount, also end up arriving. And there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of local investment into both the studio grounds and into the productions of several of these different movies. One called The Hired Wife has a really disastrous production where after the film was put into the can, the director ends up sending the only reel of the film or only set of reels of the film to New York for processing. Again, there's no processing lab in Tampa. And the plane crashes, killing the pilot and incinerating the film reel, needing the entire production to be reshot. Keaton, for his part, only gets out of the hotel once or twice. He gets eaten alive by mosquitoes when he travels to Ocala. He has a really frustrating scouting experience. And although he supposedly joined the local baseball team and had plans to buy a house in St. Petersburg, none of that comes to fruition. And he basically tells the St. Petersburg government, Collins, the Committee for the Development of Motion Pictures, and Kennedy, come back when you have something a little bit more substantial. And with that, all of a sudden, things just go from bad to worse. Kennedy ends up going to New York on a fundraising quest, and he gets into a car accident where he spends the entire summer convalescing in the hospital. And then throughout this period, the productions that were being made just go from bad to worse. Kennedy actually never comes back to St. Petersburg. He goes on vacation and they never hear from him again. So we have hundreds of thousands of dollars being spent on this facility and all this hope and expectation. And three movies do end up getting made on Wheaton Island. Fred Wright of the St. Pete's Independent later recalled that these were the three worst movies in cinema history. And we have a couple of them still available on YouTube. You could watch them, and he's not wrong. They are not good movies.
I'm gonna find a way to include the links
Yeah,
with this episode. So if you're listening to this, you too can watch The Hired Wife.
yeah, especially the recut version after the it makes you wonder like what the real version looked like before it was incinerated in a plane crash.
Mhm.
But it's a rough watch to say the least. So have your popcorn and have your jokes ready to go.
It's the world's premier movie attraction, the Disney MGM Studios theme park in Florida.
So you write that Florida history is divided into two parts, before Disney and after Disney. What is Disney?
Waka waka.
What impact did Disney World have on attracting production to the state? We all know, the Magic Kingdom, but it did have a real impact on filmmaking in Florida. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I mean, first I would credit Gary Mormino, Florida historian, with coining those terms, AD and BD, and discussing really this example of Florida after 1945 as experiencing its Big Bang, where we see this economic surge, this demographic surge, and really the emergence of the modern state of Florida with the arrival of air conditioning and all the other, development that came afterward. So Disney, I mean, certainly ends up having a very decisive impact on the state. Um, Richard Fogelstang's Married to the Mouse would do a far more substantial job of explaining just like how far-reaching that impact has been. But what I find very interesting is actually how open the Florida legislature and Florida government was to tourism and to the cultivation of the amusement park industry in Central Florida. When had it applied that same kind of vigor to the film and television industry, we may have seen a very, very different course of outcome in the mid 20th century for the motion picture industry at large. So, again, we could very briefly touch on the Reedy Creek Improvement District and how, again, like Disney was given the keys to the kingdom by the legislator. In fact, the premiere of Walt Disney's plan for Epcot, just which I think came out just several weeks after his death in 1966, was presided over by Claude Kirk, the first Republican governor of Florida since Reconstruction. Half of the Florida legislature ends up showing up to this premiere that was held in Winter Park. And there was a lot of excitement and hubbub around, of course, the building of Disney World. And subsequently, in the late 1980s, with the construction of Disney MGM Studios, Governor Bob Graham, again, Sally has just passed, was a instrumental part in bringing both Universal Studios and MGM Studios to Central Florida in the 1980s. The Graham administration was also a very active movie booster in its own right. At least several times a year, Graham traveled to Los Angeles and took meetings with studio executives, and he was very, very hands-on in cultivating the beginning of what became the Hollywood East movement in Central Florida, and also this massive resurgence in film and television in Miami in the mid 1980s. So that said, really, it's just a very interesting story of contrast, more so than Disney having the direct impact on the industry, but just showing you how the government ends up interacting with all these different opportunities.
And then, in addition to the film industry, there have been several television programs created in Florida. I think the first one I knew about was Flipper, but there was also Gentle Ben, a lot of animal shows for some reason. How did shooting for TV start in Florida, and how did it end? And very critically, did I miss my chance to be on Nickelodeon Guts?
Do you have it? Do you have it?
Sadly, I think you have. The GAC geyser had now been completely capped. And
Mhm.
I mean, maybe our talk can help to inspire voters and those who are
Yeah.
very committed to the industry,
My GAC-oriented political movement. Yeah,
bring back the GAC. Well, we're both 90s kids.
exactly. Yeah.
I think one of my most fun sequences in the book is that description of GAC Day. With this Doc Brown impersonator in a terrible wig coming in,
Hmm.
and oh my gosh, it filled me with so much nostalgia because you and me are about the same age. We're both
Hmm.
90 kids, so I grew up with like the Nickelodeon Live, where you
Hmm.
had
The
that stick
tour.
figure,
Yeah.
or no, it was like
Stick
literally
Stickly.
popsicle stick, yeah.
Yeah, Stick Stickly. Yeah.
Yeah, Dick Stickley, and he had to like, and you got to call in like what your favorite cartoon would be. And I lived in New York at the time as a kid, but we would come down to Disney at least once a year, and we would come down to Universal Studios as well. So I got to watch like as the live studio audience member, Legends of the Hidden Temple,
Hmm.
all those shows. So it has a very like close part of my heart. For sure. Going back to your initial question just about the industry, television. One of the reasons why animal programming was so popular in Florida comes down to a producer named Ivan Tors. He was a former OSS agent, partially considered to be the inspiration for James Bond, among a number of other figures, and also a really fascinating all-around guy in terms of just storytelling. He had created a film studio called Underwater Productions based out of Nassau in the Bahamas, and his first program was with a television network called Ziv. So where we eventually have the big three with NBC, ABC, CBS. Ziv was a competitor in the 1950s. It fell by the wayside pretty quickly. And his first big breakthrough in the television industry was a show called Sea Hunt, starring Lloyd Bridges. And a lot of Sea Hunt was filmed around the Bahamas, but they would do sequences at the Miami Seaquarium. And there at the time was a former lifeguard from Weeki Wachee Springs turned creature from the Black Lagoon, at least the underwater creature from the Black Lagoon, named Rico Browning. And Browning was an underwater stuntman who worked at the Seaquarium, became very close with Ivan Tors, and it was actually Rico Browning's idea to come up with the idea for Flipper. So the creature from the Black Lagoon is directly responsible for Flipper. I mean, you can't really get more different in terms of genre. His pitch initially was to write a novel, and the idea was to do a story that he called Lassie on the Water. So instead of a boy and his dog, a boy and his dolphin. And when he told Ivan Tors the idea, Tors said, forget the novel, let's do a movie. So they did a film first, and then they adapted that film also through NBC. And this is about the time that they end up moving their production studio from Nassau to be closer to the Seaquarium. Ivan Tors ends up building his own studio in South Florida called Ivan Tors Studio. And that's where we see a whole bunch of different experiments with animal programming. There's another one called Doctari. There's a movie called Zebra in the Kitchen. And of course, Gentle Ben, as you mentioned, where the original book for Gentle Ben was set as a grizzly bear in Alaska. And grizzlies are notoriously hard to tame. So it's a lot easier to work with a black bear instead. So they relocated the entire setting to the Florida Everglades. So Ivan Tour Studio was one of the first big breaks that South Florida had in the industry. Another big break was Jackie Gleason, who after the Honeymooners had his own variety talk show called The Jackie Gleason Show. And he eventually convinces CBS to build a studio so he can have access to his favorite golf course in Miami. So CBS is down in South Florida. NBC has its ties with Ivan Tour's studio. ABC had worked with Newton Perry, who had created Weeki Wachee Springs on the west coast of Florida. And they also regularly had programs coming out from ABC. So all the big television networks were pretty active in Florida in the 1960s.
They call him Flipper, Flipper, faster than lightning. No one you see is smarter than he. And we know Flipper lives in a world full of wonder, lying there under
Hollywood East itself, I think, was sort of a nomenclature that was added that the industry itself did not ask for. I think one of the biggest challenges was that as Orlando came into its own with Universal Studios and with Disney MGM, there are two major challenges. One is that Universal and Disney now had a monopoly on what productions could be made on location. So you don't have that same kind of bidding war between production companies that we see in other locations. The second major thing, too, is that just as we're seeing some pretty notable productions like, say, Parenthood, My Girl, again, the Nickelodeon programs, Shelby Woo, like from Disney Channel, all these different shows being made in Central Florida in the 1990s. Canada is on the rise too. Toronto is becoming a very constantly sought after secondary television center. You have the X-Files being made up in Vancouver. Yeah, it's so interesting because even with some of the Florida productions, like for example, My Girl was set to be in Pennsylvania. So you really don't think, I mean, granted they use Sanford as the location and it works, but you wouldn't think that Florida would be a stand-in for like a location like that.
Well, I didn't realize Problem Child 2 was shot entirely in Orlando, and that movie takes place in Oregon.
Yeah, it's so
It's
strange, right? That
hmm
the Northwest and all, but it also shows you the versatility
hmm
that Florida is able to offer. It's not just beaches, it's not just, the Everglades. It really does have that ability to stand in for almost anywhere.
Even in black and white era, you watch some of those Tarzan movies, it does feel very magical, this sort of like not foreign, but this very exotic kind of landscaping. It's enchanting, it's like I get what people saw down here.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Creature from the Black Lagoon is set in
hmm
the Brazilian rainforest, but Wakulla Springs, Silver Springs, these areas, they can replicate these types of locations. And that's really, I think, what Florida had consistently always had to offer. But, going back to your question about the collapse that ends up happening, that's one challenge is that for example, in 1991, Mayor Bill Frederick agreed to allow Richard Donner to film the demolition of Orlando City Hall for only like about $50,000. I mean, it's like bottom dollar prices by industry standards to get something that technically involved. And Danny Glover and Mel Gibson, they both come out. They shoot the scene like where the building comes down. The mayor has a cameo in the movie too, where he's the head of the bomb squad, congratulating them on blowing up the building and all of that. But once that scene was done, they go back to Los Angeles. The movie is not filmed in Orlando, just that very big sequence. And then even like movies like Ron Howard's Parenthood, which was one of the first movies done on what became that Universal backlot in Orlando, that was a stand-in for St. Louis. Again, talking about variety and locations. And again, Parenthood, I mean, it's a mid-budget production and it definitely works, but that production's only going to last for a certain amount of time. With the Disney Channel shows, I think some of the problems was that they never built Orlando into the environment. Like you never had a Shelby Woo episode where, she teams up with Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway, like in their magic heyday, and they have to go, track down somebody. Like Orlando was never included into the story. And that I think was one limitation. The other, as we mentioned, was Canada. The rise of Eastern Europe also as another very compelling secondary film center. And finally, well, our mortal enemies within the Sun Belt, Louisiana, Georgia, and the Carolinas, which have all very much emerged in the last couple decades as very active and vibrant film and television production centers. So, I mean, today, the CW dominates Wilmington. Marvel has come to take control of Atlanta and Pinewood Studios. We have so many different shows being made in Louisiana, and it's become almost a punchline. If you have a show about Florida and it's supposed to be set in Florida, you're going to go to Louisiana or you're going to go to Georgia. And a lot of that had to do with the collapse of tax incentives and also a lack of institutional support. Again, we talked about infrastructure, which has always consistently been a challenge within Florida. But I mean, at a time when we were in our heyday in the 2000s and early 2010s, with shows like Burn Notice, Dexter, The Glades, with again, big budget productions like Bad Boys coming to Miami, there was enough of an ecosystem that could build up and continue to build upon itself. The biggest challenge has now since come without those types of additional, just even tacit shows of support, like through tax incentives. This goes back to the Jeb Bush administration in '99, when a number of different tax incentive bills were passed through the legislature. But starting in 2012, the Florida legislature has consistently voted against some tax incentives and has consistently also pushed against the industry at large. In fact, and again, you see this in my book, a lot of that same type of economic populism that was used in the 1910s by politicians like Sidney Katz has now been used by our own state politicians to justify this sort of antagonism to the film and television industry. It's really quite interesting that we've come completely full circle in so many different ways. The same kind of prohibitionism that had smothered the Florida film industry in its cradle had now been responsible for selling out the industry to, again, pretty traditionally conservative states like Georgia and Louisiana and the Carolinas. So it's just a very interesting contradiction, to say the least, right there.
There are so many films and TV shows made in Florida, so many, that you call out throughout the course of your book. Which stand out to you as some of the most significant in telling this story? And which of those are your personal favorites?
That's a really good and challenging question. Well, I would definitely start with The Flying Ace. It really is a marvel of silent filmmaking in its own right. It's well paced. It has actually some really good dynamic scenes. And considering the lack of budget and support, Norman does make a movie that is entertaining. I can have undergraduate students who may have never even seen a silent film before sit through the entire movie and thoroughly enjoy what they've seen. So if we're going to the silent era, that's definitely one that I would make a pitch for. Tarzan Finds the Sun is a lot of fun if you want to get the landscape and environment of Silver Springs, along with The Yearling, with Marjorie Kinnan Rollins' adaptation of it. That has such a fascinating, troubled production in its own right, but it's a great lens into Ocala National Forest and that early era in Florida filmmaking. Johnny Tiger is a really interesting local Central Florida story that I love to showcase. Arjan Hugh was a great local film personality in Orlando. And the story of Johnny Tiger, which talks about a mixed race Seminole man, although they'll use some more politically incorrect terms to describe him within the film, caught between both the modern Florida and the old Seminole tradition, is one that's very campy, but still a lot of fun to watch. I'm trying to think of others that we can think about here going into the 70s and 80s. I mean, you can't not talk about Florida without talking about Miami Vice. And the story of Miami Vice and its making too is really fascinating, because Miami Vice is directly responsible for saving the South Beach Art Deco district. Had it not been for Miami Vice, we might not have had Miami as we know it even to this very day. Going into more modern times, I would definitely say shows like Burn Notice are very near and dear to my heart. Dexter is a great snapshot of South Florida throughout this time. And more recently, Barry Jenkins's Moonlight and Sean Baker's The Florida Project are all, I think, great examples. Victor Nunez, also, who has launched most of his career directly in Florida, although he would not describe himself as a Florida filmmaker. His use of Florida's landscape, environment, and very distinctive questions around identity of what it means to be a Floridian are very thoroughly enjoyable. These are just a few that are coming to mind, though.
So what was the biggest surprise you had working on this book? Every time, historians work on something, they always come across more than they expected. What was the surprise that you had while doing your research for this book?
It's interesting. First of all, it's Florida, so a lot of very strange and fascinating characters in their own right. I think my favorite story is that I uncovered as I started writing the book what's the most recent story, and that is the Ocala Drive-In. So I'll briefly kind of sum up here. In March and April of 2020, there was only one place where first run films were still being shown as the COVID-19 pandemic just sent us into panic, had us, hoard all the toilet paper and lock down inside our homes. And that was the Ocala Drive-In. So again, we're talking just a couple miles down the road from Silver Springs, where the Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan films were made, where Rico Browning had started his career, and so many different iconic Florida films had been made. And it's here that we have a man by the name of John Watzke. His family had worked as projectionists going all the way back to the Spanish influenza pandemic. His grandfather helped form a projectionist union during the pandemic. And here we have him offering at bottom dollar prices this chance for escape, even within the confines of social distancing, that I think was just so necessary. He became sort of an unlikely internet celebrity and hero during the early stages of COVID-19, and was such a fascinating character to watch that story unfold. So, I mean, that alone, I think, just shows you Florida's ongoing and continued commitment to the film industry. Even if our state and local government has not remained as committed, Floridians themselves, at least from the ground up, are definitely thoroughly interested.
So one last question, maybe more of a call to action. Looking to the future, what would it take to make Florida a motion picture paradise again? Is it mostly a matter of tax incentives, as you talked about with Louisiana and Georgia? And is it just that there's so much more competition now that it's mostly just sort of like a race to the bottom?
Well, what's interesting is that I would say that the motion picture industry right now looks more like the motion picture industry of the 1900s and the 1910s, when those first filmmakers were coming to North Florida. We're finally in a space where Hollywood, it's not Hollywood anymore, not in the same sense that it was, say, in the golden age between the 1930s and 1950s. We're in a far more decentralized environment where our iPhones can shoot better quality films than any godforsaken experiment that you and me would have attempted back in the 2000s.
The Florida Project was shot on an iPhone.
Exactly. And it looks great. I mean, it's a
Mhm.
marvel of 2010s filmmaking right there. I'm jealous because I remember buying a $2,500 mini DV camera from B&H in New York, and I was the man with the movie camera when I was an undergraduate in college, and I thought this was so cool and cutting edge with my little mini DV, cassettes and everything else. And now, I mean, it's just amazing, like how fragmented the industry is, and how anybody can now pick up a camera and tell some truly amazing stories. So going back to that question, I mean, certainly governmental support would go a long way, especially just even taking a bite out of what Carolina and Georgia and Louisiana has taken from us. At the very least, make it so that a show called Florida Man is actually filmed in Florida and not in North Carolina. Or a show like On Becoming a God in Central Florida is filmed in Central Florida and not Louisiana. One of the big problems was that like a show like Bloodline was slated for 5 seasons and it was prematurely canceled because of the lack of additional incentives. It's a factor, but it's not the only factor, certainly. Another thing, too, is local infrastructure. I think we need to start with our film schools, and we have some incredible film schools. UCF's film school is really a marvel of expertise. University of Miami, FSU produced Barry Jenkins, and that's the thing. We see all these different examples of Ringling College too would be another one that would come to mind here, of places where local homegrown filmmakers can tell their own stories about their home on their own terms. And even just starting there, and I think that's something that also has been a recurring factor in Florida's history, is that they will put the cart before the horse. So going back to the story of Kennedy City and Weeden Island, had they started small and not like went right for the A-listers and the very big budget productions, and started with like the equivalent of the Moonlights, of the Florida projects, of these very personal local stories, then you're going to build the infrastructure. And, the quote, Field of Dreams, you build it, then they come. And so it's cooperation, it's infrastructure, And it's also just making sure that the students that we are cultivating right now stay in Florida instead of encouraging them to go to Georgia or to go to North Carolina or Louisiana or anywhere else but here. So that's my solution.
The arts and culture budget is a hot topic right now, and I think this is the long-term effect of supporting or not supporting those kinds of things, is not just what happens now, but happens 10, 15, 20 years down the road as well.
And this is, like, I think, one of the things I mentioned with economic populism being used by some of these politicians. This is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democrat issue. This is not about liberals or conservatives. It's about just good common sense business. It's estimated that nearly $2 billion in local spending has collectively been lost since the last of these tax incentive bills had been axed over 10 years ago. This is money that also comes into the local state economy. I mean, when you bring a production to a community, it's not just the production itself, it's the catering, it's the use of local restaurants, it's buying out local spaces for rent for a fixed amount of time to shoot your films. There are all these other factors in spending that end up going into it. And, again, I don't want to trash talk any specific politicians. I really do try to remain pretty politically neutral when it comes to what's happening here. But it's fascinating because, again, we wouldn't call necessarily a state like Louisiana or Georgia, these bastions of bohemians who are, pushing out against the norm either. So, a lot of it's just common sense. And I think if we can get to a place where we can just get to talk that common sense to our leaders, we could see some real substantial change.
So, of course, we always like to end every episode with a book recommendation and a film recommendation. This week's book, of course, is Motion Picture Paradise, A History of Florida's Film and Television Industry by Dr. David Morton. And then we had gone back and forth. There truly are so many great films made in Florida. And I feel like we could have done a whole nother episode on other things from the book that we missed. I mean, we did over an hour and a half, it looks like, at this point. And we didn't say Scarface once. We didn't say Caddyshack once. Ernest Saves Christmas, one of the greatest films ever made, shot entirely in Orlando. But truly and honestly, with the two of us here, two UCF graduates, two fans of fine and less than fine movies, there really is only one movie to recommend, and I'm going to let you take it over from there.
Yeah, so we can't not wrap up without talking about Miami Connection, filmed at least in part on location at UCF. That's still one of my favorite parts of rewatching this movie. I'll watch it at least once a year, and you'll see Milliken Hall in the background, the fountain, the walk over to the library,
the communications building. That's the one that always gets me the most excited.
And it has a banging soundtrack, which, Ross, I'll be very disappointed if you don't sign off with at least a small excerpt of.
I have already been cutting it together.
Awesome. I'm so excited. It tells the story of a group of Taekwondo masters who also have a rock and roll band called Dragon Sound. So by day, they're Taekwondo masters and UCF students. By night, they're rock and roll stars. And when a gang of drug-dealing ninjas try to bring cocaine to Orlando and start dealing at UCF, it's going to be up to Dragon Sound to bring the peace.
Yes, and if you're wondering, why is a movie titled Miami Connection set almost entirely in Orlando, then you are on the right path, because that is the kind of attention to detail you really do not need to bring to this film.
Every rewatch, I have a question.
But yeah, YK Kim, a local celebrity, somebody that I had the pleasure of knowing in my childhood.
Oh, wow.
And really just add him to the list of incredible characters in this book. But yeah, I think it's safe to say we are now friends forever. That's really the best way to go out on this. Dr. David Morton, thank you so much. I had an incredible time. As I said already, we could do easily one more episode just on this book, but of course, definitely want to have you back sometime soon. It's not a matter of if, but when. So thank you very much, and we look forward to having you back very soon.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Forever we'll be together. We're on top 'cause
I worked with a guy who was on Guts and won and had the aggro crag, and he just mentioned it like offhand, like something he was like slightly embarrassed about. I was so angry at him. I was like, I would introduce myself to every person I ever meet by saying,
Oh
I
yeah.
have a glowing piece of the Radical Rock in my house.